8:47 p.m. Live National Television. The studio is buzzing with lights, cameras, and the expectation of entertainment. A liberal host with a million-strong audience leans confidently into the camera, flashing a rehearsed smile. He's done this hundreds of times. Tonight, he believes, will be no different. His goal? Easy laughs, a few viral jabs, and the perfect target sits right beside him. Karoline Leavitt, young, sharp, conservative. But to him, she's just another press secretary, just another political pawn to be mocked for sport. He expects her to stumble, to get emotional, to walk right into his trap, live on air. What he doesn't know is that she's seen this script before. She's heard the laughter before it's earned. She's watched smug smiles collapse under the weight of truth, and she's not here to play along. In less than 2 minutes, she'll do something no one in that studio expected. She won't raise her voice. She won't insult. She'll simply quote the Constitution, word for word, and flip the entire narrative in front of millions. His microphone will cut, his team will panic, and that confident smirk will vanish. Because at the 57-second mark, Karoline says something that will spread faster than anything in his entire career, and nothing after that will ever be the same. The studio lights were bright and cold, casting a pale glow over the sleek, modern set that had been designed more for performance than dialogue. The audience seats, arranged in a semicircle around the central stage, were filled with spectators who knew exactly what kind of show they had come for. They weren't expecting a balanced conversation or a challenging debate. They were waiting for entertainment, for the usual sharp jabs and rehearsed arrogance that defined the host's nightly monologue. He was a man known for his timing, his sarcasm, and his ability to bury a guest without ever raising his voice. Tonight, he was smiling even before the cameras went live. Karoline Leavitt sat opposite him, under the same lights, with a face that betrayed nothing. She had been offered a single segment. 6 minutes, the host had said, to respond to a series of light questions. But everyone in the building knew what that really meant. It meant ambush. It meant ridicule. It meant clipping her answers out of context for tomorrow's social media cycle. She wasn't the first conservative guest to sit in that chair, and she knew she wouldn't be the last. But she had agreed to appear anyway, not out of naivety, but because she understood something they didn't, that underestimating someone in front of millions of viewers was a risk, not a guarantee. The makeup team had finished with her 10 minutes earlier. They'd asked if she wanted to soften her look. She declined. The producer had handed her a revised list of topics, vague, sanitized, which meant none of them would be relevant to the questions she'd be asked. She didn't bother to read it. Instead, she watched the monitors in the hallway, listened to the way the host joked about bringing fire to the table, and how the crowd responded with laughter before even knowing who the guest would be. She noted the rhythm, the structure, the trap being set. When the segment began, the camera panned to the host first. He grinned directly into the lens, delivering his intro with the same smooth cadence he always used when introducing someone he planned to humiliate. He called her the youngest mouthpiece of a former administration, referred to her as the one they sent to handle damage control, and used the phrase stepping out of the press room and into the real world. The audience laughed on cue. Applause followed. None of it surprised her. She waited, posture straight, hands folded. The host's smile widened when she didn't react. He thought she was tense, off guard, maybe even a little scared. But she was only measuring, not his words but the room. She could see the confidence in his eyes, the certainty that he would remain in control of the narrative, that the segment would unfold exactly as every other one had. This was his turf, his lights, his microphone, his followers. He believed that the audience had already chosen a side, and in most cases, he would have been right. The teleprompters fed him the opening remarks. He leaned forward, relaxed and speaking not to her, but to the audience. An old tactic designed to reduce the guest's presence by treating them like a subject rather than a participant. He made subtle jabs about knowing when to speak and when to listen, and referenced her age as though it were an accident rather than an asset. Every line was calculated, each word had been tested, refined, and rehearsed for the kind of laugh that plays well in clip compilations and late-night recaps. What he didn't realize, or perhaps forgot, was that Karoline was not just familiar with media dynamics, she had lived inside them. She had stood at a White House podium, fielding aggressive questions from a hostile press corps. She had sparred with journalists who were far less polite and far more relentless than anyone in this room. The only difference here was that the hostility came dressed in comedy, wrapped in punchlines and applause. But the core was the same. Manufacture a moment, control the reaction, and walk away looking untouchable. She noticed the way the audience glanced between him and her, uncertain whether they should laugh yet or wait for a signal. It was a trained behavior, learned from watching how power operated on TV. The host gave them that signal with a knowing smirk and a sarcastic quip, and they responded right on time. Karoline didn't flinch. She simply blinked slowly and waited for the air to settle. She understood now that the entire structure was built on momentum, on assumption, on the belief that she would play her role as the stiff, out-of-place conservative, with outdated ideas and no punch to land in return. But she hadn't come to play that role. The host turned back to her, finally acknowledging her directly. His smile was sharper now, edged with anticipation. He was ready for the back and forth, ready to trigger the moment where she would stumble, lose her footing, say something that could be twisted out of context. He was ready to win, not with truth, but with rhythm, charm, and the easy arrogance of someone who had never been publicly challenged in his own domain. What he wasn't ready for, what no one in that room expected, was silence. Not the awkward kind, not the confused, scrambling kind, but the still, purposeful kind. The kind that changes the pacing of a conversation. The kind that draws attention not because it's uncomfortable, but because it feels like something is about to shift. Karoline didn't jump in. She didn't rush. She allowed the silence to linger for a beat longer than it should have, just enough to change the tempo. She was no longer following the rhythm of the show. She was preparing to break it. And as the laughter faded, as the crowd waited for her to play her part in the joke, she did something the host never anticipated. She looked directly into the lens, not at him, not at the audience, but through them. That was the moment the segment stopped being entertainment and started becoming history. The first smile came not from amusement, but from recognition. It arrived like a signal, a controlled, deliberate flicker of expression that marked the beginning of a shift. It wasn't the kind of smile that begged for approval or sought to soften tension. It was the kind that said, "I've seen this before. I know exactly where this is going, and I'm already 10 moves ahead." Karoline Leavitt's smile appeared in the brief pause between the host's first loaded question and her response. The audience hadn't registered it yet. They were still recovering from the host's punchline, laughing with the momentum of people who had decided in advance who the joke was supposed to be about. But Karoline wasn't reacting the way they expected. There was no offense, no flustered attempt to defend herself. There wasn't even a raised eyebrow or tight-lipped annoyance. Just that smile, a slight curve of the lips, calm and composed, like the first breath before a carefully prepared strike. The host, perched comfortably in his chair, misread it entirely. He saw it as nervous. He thought she was stalling, unsure of how to respond, perhaps intimidated by the spotlight or by his dominance on set. He leaned in a little, ready to press his advantage, thinking that he had her cornered. That's what the smile told him, because he didn't know how to read it properly. It wasn't fear, it was control. Karoline sat with her hands still folded, her posture unchanged. Her eyes didn't dart around the studio, didn't look for support or sympathy. They stayed fixed, not on the host, but slightly past him, as if seeing a longer arc than anyone else in the room. That was always her strength, not the ability to speak louder or to overwhelm, but to wait, to measure, and to dismantle, piece by piece, without warning. She didn't rush her answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and deliberate. There was no edge, no sharpness, just clarity. Each word was placed with care, not for maximum impact, but for maximum control. The content wasn't confrontational, not yet, but it wasn't passive either. It was something far more dangerous in a space built on spectacle. It was calm. And in an environment where dominance was measured in wit, volume, and applause, calm became a kind of rebellion. As she spoke, The audience's energy shifted slightly. It was subtle, just a few heads tilting, a few brows furrowed, a few phones lowered as people started listening, rather than performing their roles as laugh track participants. The host still smiled, but the corners of his mouth didn't rise quite as confidently. He sensed it too, though he wouldn't admit it. Something about the tone, the pacing, the ease with which she navigated the question he thought would shake her, unsettled the balance of power he'd assumed was his. Karoline wasn't reacting. She was revealing, not facts, not arguments, but presence. That smile had been the signal, and now the structure of the conversation was starting to bend around her. The host tried to regain control by interrupting, injecting another jab, a sarcastic observation about her background. But the timing was off. His line didn't land the same way. The laughter it triggered was thinner, more delayed. It no longer rode the wave of anticipation. It had to fight to stay afloat. She continued, unfazed. Her voice didn't change, but her phrasing did. It became more precise, more direct. She started steering the topic, slowly without announcing it, turning the conversation toward ground she had prepared. The smile returned briefly as she made a pointed remark. Nothing inflammatory, nothing that could be easily clipped into outrage, but something that shifted the weight of the exchange entirely. And then came the first pause, intentional, loaded. She stopped speaking just long enough to let the silence press into the room. It wasn't awkward, it was controlled, like a beat in a symphony, allowing what had been said to settle before the next movement. The host, again, misread it. He jumped in to fill the space, eager to regain rhythm, but the interruption fell flat. It felt rushed, defensive, like a man trying to keep pace with someone who had just changed the rules of the game. Karoline let him speak. She listened, her head slightly tilted, that faint smile returning, not out of amusement, but out of recognition. She had been here before. Not in this chair, not in this studio, but in this moment. The moment when the person across from her realizes they're no longer in control of the conversation, but can't admit it yet. The camera, ever neutral, captured both faces at once. His, tightening with each word. Hers, serene but focused. The audience, caught between them, began to sense the tension beneath the surface, the silent duel that was unfolding without raised voices or dramatic gestures. It was happening in expressions, in timing, in the weight of silence. This wasn't a meltdown. It wasn't a takedown. It was something more unnerving, a quiet, precise shift in gravity. Karoline wasn't challenging the host directly. She was letting him exhaust his rhythm while she built hers. The smile was the beginning, not a reaction, but a declaration. Not loud, but loud enough for those paying attention. And by the time she asked her next question, not defensive, but rhetorical, purposeful, the audience had already stopped laughing. They were listening now, not because they were told to, but because somewhere between the smile and the silence, the show had stopped being a routine and started becoming real. Under the warm, blinding lights of the studio, a shift was taking place. Quiet at first, then unmistakable. The crowd didn't notice it immediately, still lulled by the host's practiced rhythm and well-timed grins. The control room, too, remained unaware, busy switching camera angles and monitoring feeds, assuming that everything was moving according to plan. But in that moment, something deeper was unfolding. Karoline Leavitt, once positioned as the passive guest, the one to be interrupted, teased, and painted as out of touch, had subtly begun to take command. Not by speaking louder, but by speaking better. It started with a statement, a simple, clear response to a question the host had thrown out half-mockingly. The kind of question meant to derail, to corner. But her answer didn't dodge or deflect. It restructured. Her phrasing, careful yet firm, ignored the provocation and instead redirected the conversation entirely. She turned the lens outward, moving past herself, past the host and into the broader issue. The role of media, of narrative framing, of who actually controls the flow of information in spaces like this. As she spoke, her tempo remained steady. She didn't raise her voice, didn't lean forward, didn't perform for the cameras. She simply spoke, and the content of her words carried more weight than any flash of drama could. She began outlining how public discourse had shifted, not because of citizens, but because of those who claimed to represent them. How hosts, influencers, even institutions had come to prioritize attention over accuracy, applause over understanding. It was not an attack. It was an observation so well constructed, so free of personal venom, that it cut deeper than any insult. The host shifted in his chair. His smile, once effortless, began to strain. He interjected with a quick line, a joke, hoping to deflate the seriousness with humor, to reassert his dominance with a chuckle. But it didn't land. The audience, who had laughed easily just minutes before, now paused. Some smiled politely, but the timing was off. They were no longer riding his wave. They were watching something else entirely. Something real. Karoline continued, tying the evolution of political dialogue to the fragmentation of trust. She spoke about how cynicism wasn't born in Washington, but in studios just like this one, where truth became a punchline and complexity was trimmed down for runtime. Her words weren't just critiques. They were reflections of a growing discontent many viewers carried silently. And now, voiced plainly on a stage not meant for them, those thoughts found articulation. The host tried again. He leaned in, interrupting mid-sentence, pressing for clarification that wasn't necessary. His tone was firmer now, no longer playful. It had lost its rhythm. The interruption was not sharp. It was clumsy, a defense disguised as engagement. Karoline didn't react to it. She paused, waited, then calmly resumed, unshaken. That was the moment even the less attentive observers realized. She wasn't here to survive his format. She was here to transcend it. Her hands stayed folded. Her voice stayed low. And yet every word she said landed harder than the last. Without accusing, she revealed. Without dramatizing, she exposed. She didn't need to win the audience's sympathy. She had captured their respect. And that, on a stage built for performance, was far more dangerous than any slogan or outburst. The host leaned back. He glanced toward the producer's booth. The tension in his posture gave him away. It was no longer a segment under his control. The guest was not merely countering his points. She was unraveling the very scaffolding of his show's design. Piece by piece, the illusion that had framed the host as the voice of reason, of humor, of intellectual dominance, began to fade. Not through confrontation, but through coherence. The live chat, scrolling at the speed of reaction, was catching up. Messages flooded in, not laughing but quoting. Viewers began to clip her lines in real time, stitching them into posts, tagging platforms, dropping timestamps. They didn't need editing. They didn't need commentary. The moment was self-contained, undeniable. Karoline introduced historical references, cases, principles, originalist interpretations of constitutional liberties, not to show off but to remind. Her depth of knowledge wasn't paraded. It was placed precisely where it needed to be, reinforcing her points with calm assurance. She didn't just understand the First Amendment. She embodied its purpose in that moment, speaking freely, clearly, unshaken in a space where she was never meant to be heard. The host, still hoping to recover, tried again. He spoke louder. His words came quicker, less measured. But it was too late. The audience had already shifted their attention. They weren't reacting to him. They were watching her. She concluded the segment, not with a slogan, but with a question. A simple one, rhetorical, designed not to challenge the host, but to challenge the viewer. And she let it hang there, unhurried, as if daring the silence to respond. It didn't. Nothing could. The producer gestured off-screen. Time was up. But the show wasn't ending. It was transforming. What had started as a stage for ridicule had become a platform for reckoning, and at its center sat a woman who had used nothing but language, logic, and poise to flip an entire conversation on its head. By the time the cameras cut, no one was laughing. Not because they were angry, but because they just witnessed something they couldn't unsee. The studio had grown uncomfortably quiet, a kind of stillness that didn't come naturally to places built for constant movement, laughter, and applause. Even the cameras, automated and gliding slowly across the space, seemed to hesitate, as if they too had registered the shift. Karoline Leavitt remained composed in her seat, her eyes steady, her tone unchanged. But something in the energy of the room had transformed. There was a density to the silence now, not of awkwardness, but anticipation. Everyone sensed it, even if they couldn't quite articulate what was coming. They could feel it. The host, visibly agitated, clung to his smile like a mask starting to slip at the edges. He leaned forward, arms crossing, words spilling out faster than before, trying to pull the moment back into familiar territory. He had relied on momentum his entire career, on being quicker, louder, always one step ahead in tone, if not in substance. But Karoline wasn't playing that game. She wasn't chasing his pace. She was sitting in silence. And that silence wasn't passive. It was preparatory. Then she moved. Her hand, calm and controlled, reached beneath the table and retrieved a folded sheet of paper. Not a prop, not a talking point, a printed document. She didn't wave it. She didn't announce it. She placed it gently on the desk between them, smoothed its edges, and looked at him. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with intent. The host paused, glancing at the paper, his words momentarily lost. Something in him understood what it was, even before she spoke. Karoline began to read, not her own words, his, a statement he had made years ago, long enough for him to assume it had faded into the background noise of his digital footprint. It hadn't. She had found it, preserved it, and now in front of cameras, audience, and a live feed broadcast to millions, she was reading it back to him. Word for word, a tweet, sharp and smug, one he had made at a time when he had assumed the world would never hold him accountable for it. Something dismissive of the Constitution, something he had written in jest, but something that now, in this context, revealed far more than he intended. The audience froze. Laughter died on their lips before it could even rise. The host tried to interject, but Karoline wasn't finished. She read the post in its entirety, then folded the paper again and placed it neatly beside her. Her voice remained soft, measured, but now there was steel behind it. Not a weaponized rage, but an undeniable clarity. She didn't accuse him. She didn't editorialize. She let his own words stand, echoing in the space he once controlled. Then came the pivot. Without pausing, she began quoting the First Amendment. Not selectively, not as a soundbite. The full passage, articulated carefully, confidently, as though she had spent her life not just studying it, but internalizing it, as though each word carried the weight of responsibility. And as she spoke, the host's posture changed. He shifted in his chair. The grin was gone. His fingers tapped nervously on the table. He looked not at her, but beyond, at the producer, at the teleprompter, at anywhere else but the moment that had now turned against him. The power dynamic had collapsed. Karoline wasn't reacting. She was leading. And what's more, she was undeniable. The audience wasn't just witnessing a rebuttal. They were witnessing a reversal. A guest who had been expected to absorb ridicule had instead delivered reckoning. The moment had passed the threshold of being recoverable. No clever line, no punchy retort could reset what had been said. Still, the host tried. He stammered into a defensive question, something about context or humor, hoping to frame the past as harmless. But the room had already made its decision. No one was laughing, no one was clapping. The studio had become a courtroom, and Karoline had just submitted her evidence. All of it calmly, without insult, without escalation, just truth, delivered in its most dangerous form, unshaken and direct. The production team scrambled behind the scenes. Eyes darted across monitors. Social media feeds were already lighting up. Clips of her quote were spreading. Journalists were tweeting in real time. This wasn't just a moment anymore. It was a story. And Karoline? She sat still. No celebration, no smugness. She had not come to score points. She had come to correct the record. The weight of that act in such a space was revolutionary. In an environment designed to trivialize everything into entertainment, she had brought substance, and it had landed like a hammer. The host's attempt to pivot again came too late. He raised his voice, not in anger, but in desperation. He tried to recenter himself in the conversation, but his words felt thin now, hollow echoes against the force of what had just been said. Caroline answered his interruption with a pause, a blink, and then a final sentence. Not flashy, not rehearsed, but so direct, so final, that the room seemed to shrink. She reminded him and everyone watching that principles either apply always or not at all. That selective application was not clever. It was cowardice. And that truth didn't need applause. It just needed space. Then she fell silent, and the silence once again did the rest. The collapse didn't come all at once. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. It came in pieces, small fractures in the studio's atmosphere, like hairline cracks spreading across glass, unnoticed until they touched the edges and everything shattered. The moment Karoline Leavitt finished speaking, a stillness settled that no one could immediately break. The host sat frozen, blinking in the two bright lights, his mouth slightly open, lips moving without words forming. There was no prompt from the teleprompter. The screen had stopped moving. The crew in the control room didn't speak. The audience, trained by years of cue cards and clapping signs, waited for a signal, but none came. The silence, long enough to be uncomfortable, stretched further, transforming into something dangerous. Reflection. He tried to speak. He tried to laugh. He tried to make the moment smaller than it was, to drag it back into the familiar territory of banter, irony, detachment. But it didn't work. His voice, once so effortless in delivery, now came out tight, edged with panic. He fumbled through half a sentence, interrupted himself, tried to switch topics, anything to regain the pace that had carried him through thousands of segments. But the air had changed. It was thicker now. He could feel it in his chest. He wasn't hosting anymore. He was reacting. Caroline sat still, eyes steady, expression unreadable. She had said what she needed to say. She wasn't here to savor the damage. She wasn't here to make him squirm. Her work was done the moment his narrative collapsed under its own weight. She had not attacked him personally. She had not raised her voice or used inflammatory language. But that made it worse, because without hostility, without anything to push back against, there was nothing he could fight. There was only what he had said and what she had shown. Behind the scenes, the production team scrambled. Some were on headsets, whispering furiously. Others stared blankly at monitors that continued to broadcast live. Someone muted the host's microphone for a second too long, cutting off the beginning of another desperate sentence. When it came back on, the moment had already slipped past him. The transition, the clever segue, the final laugh, none of it worked anymore. Everything he said sounded like noise after the silence Caroline had left behind. Outside the studio, things moved faster. On social media, clips of the exchange were already circulating. Accounts across the political spectrum shared the video. People who had never heard of Karoline Leavitt were now quoting her. The host's name began trending, not for a witty remark, not for a bold confrontation, but for the absence of control he had shown. Commentators used words like dismantled, exposed, humiliated, words he had once enjoyed applying to others. Now they were attached to him. He saw it in real time. During a commercial break, his assistant handed him a tablet. He shouldn't have looked, but he did. The clip had already passed 500,000 views on one platform alone. The comments were brutal. Some were gleeful, others were stunned, but few were supportive. He had always believed that his base would protect him, that his audience would see any challenge as unfair, would rally. But this was different. This wasn't a hit piece or an attack ad. It was footage, uncut, unedited, and he had no defense. In the following segment, he tried to recover. He smiled wider, his posture more exaggerated, his voice louder. He overcompensated. He laughed too hard at a guest joke. He rushed through a political summary like he was being chased by time itself, but nothing landed. The audience clapped politely. Their energy had shifted. They were no longer entertained. They were observing. And Caroline, she was already gone. She had walked off the stage quietly without shaking hands, without posing for photos. Her phone remained off. She wasn't checking the reactions. She wasn't crafting follow-up tweets. She didn't need to. The story had moved on from her. It was now about him, about how someone who had mocked others for so long had finally been met with someone who didn't need to fight to win. Someone who just needed to speak clearly enough to reveal the hollowness behind the performance. The next day, headlines broke. Not on tabloids, on major outlets. Talk show host stunned by constitutional showdown. Karoline Leavitt silences stage with First Amendment masterclass. Power shift in primetime. Sponsors called. Not many, just one or two. But that was enough. One pulled an ad block. Another delayed a segment by. His producers began discussing internal strategy, whether to issue a clarification, a follow-up episode, an apology. The network executives weren't panicked. Yet. But they had noticed, and they were paying attention. The host himself avoided the conversation. He didn't show up to the post-show meeting. He didn't reply to group messages. He sat in his office, staring at his reflection on the black screen of a turned-off monitor. He had built his career on control, on being the smartest voice in the room, and in 2 minutes, a calm voice had taken that away without shouting, without anger, just by being better prepared, better read, and less afraid. He would go on. He would do another show the next night. He would smile again. He would speak again. But something would be missing. A layer of certainty, of untouchable performance, would never quite return. Because now, no matter how he framed it, no matter how he spun it, everyone had seen what he looked like when the mask cracked, and no amount of laughter could drown that out. The studio lights dimmed slowly after the show went off the air, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air like the last vibration of a struck bell. Staff moved about the space with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact, careful in their movements. The laughter that usually echoed in the halls after a segment like that was absent. Conversations were hushed, fragmented. Monitors still displayed the paused frame of the host's face at the end of the broadcast, one that looked far less certain than when the show had begun. Karoline Leavitt didn't stay. She left without fuss, walking through the backstage corridor with the same composed silence that had defined her presence on air. She didn't look back. There were no post-show interviews, no selfies, no obligatory social media shout-outs. Her work was done. She had come into a space built for control, been underestimated by its architect, and had unraveled the performance without ever raising her voice. Her silence as she left was not withdrawal. It was punctuation. Outside the studio, the night buzzed with electricity, not from the cameras or the production team, but from the internet. The clip, just under 2 minutes long, had already taken root across multiple platforms. It began as a single upload, her reading the host's old tweet, quoting the Constitution, and sitting in calm silence as the host floundered. But within 15 minutes, it had spread into dozens of reposts, stitched into reaction videos, layered with commentary, remixed with dramatic music, turned into reels with subtitles. The moment wasn't just viral, it had become a symbol. What shocked most people was the response. It didn't split neatly along ideological lines. Liberals, conservatives, centrists, many who watched the clip agreed on one thing. The control had shifted, and not through aggression or humiliation, but through clarity. Karoline's composure, her refusal to fall into the trap of outrage or performative defensiveness, had revealed something rarely seen in these confrontational formats: integrity under pressure. Her popularity soared, not because she screamed louder, but because she didn't need to scream at all. Back at the network, the atmosphere in the editing bay was tense. The team debated whether to cut the segment for highlights or to bury it entirely. The usual plan would have been to frame it with a new narrative, edit it to soften the blow, overlay graphics that could reestablish the host's authority. But none of that felt plausible now. The internet had already taken control of the story. Any attempt to reframe it would be seen as dishonest, and worse, irrelevant. The host remained in his dressing room long after the show ended. He sat in silence, staring at his phone, watching the clip loop for the 5th, maybe 6th time. He tried to hear it differently each time, tried to find a mistake she'd made, something to point to, something to discredit. But there was nothing. Her words were precise. Her tone had never wavered. She hadn't said anything cruel or inflammatory. In fact, that was what made it so effective. She had simply reflected the truth, his own words, his own contradictions, and let them speak for themselves. At one point, he scrolled through social media, then stopped. The trending tags had moved past him. They were now about her. Not just her name, but what she represented. Silent strength. First Amendment moment. The Constitution live. People were quoting her like she was a public thinker, not a guest. Memes were already circulating. News outlets were writing pieces with headlines that danced on the edge of embarrassment. The ratings team sent in a report. Spike in viewers after the moment. Sharp drop afterward. A perfect spike of relevance, just not the kind the host had hoped for. His team offered to draft a response, a tweet, a statement, a way to spin it, joke about it, reframe the moment as a good discussion or a necessary exchange of views. But he didn't respond. He just sat there, watching the loop play again, hearing the silence after her final line, the silence that had swallowed his platform whole. Karoline, meanwhile, flew home. She didn't speak to the press at the airport. She didn't post about the show. Her team released a brief statement. Karoline appreciated the opportunity to speak. She hopes more conversations can be rooted in principle. It was brief, firm, and it did exactly what it needed to. It elevated her above the noise. The absence of gloating became its own message. Within 48 hours, more than 6 million people had watched the moment across various platforms. Conservative media praised her composure. Independent analysts admired her restraint. Even some traditionally liberal voices acknowledged that she had outclassed the host, not in ideology, but in discipline. And in the face of a collapsing performance, that discipline had spoken louder than anything else. Sponsors didn't flee, but some paused. A few quietly pulled ad buys for the next few shows, citing a desire to review segment structure. The executives took note. The tone in meetings shifted. For the first time in years, the host wasn't the undisputed center of gravity in the room. He was no longer the one with the untouchable image. He was just a man who had been outpaced in a conversation he thought he could control. He would go on to host again. He would recover, at least publicly. But the crack had formed. The illusion had broken. Audiences had seen behind the curtain. And Karoline Leavitt, the guest he once planned to embarrass, had walked away not only intact, but ascendant. Not because she shouted, not because she humiliated him, but because she told the truth calmly, and then let the world decide what that truth meant.